The second area of forgiveness is forgiving those who have wronged us. Psalm 55 speaks to this in an almost painful way. It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me. I could hide from them. But it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, with whom I kept pleasant company. We walked in the house of God with a throng. Christian leaders are, by nature of their vocation, deeply involved in the lives of people. For many, that involvement includes preaching, teaching, counseling, baptizing, marrying, burying, dedicating children, and so on. We can't help but find ourselves connected to the lives of people, truly loving and valuing them. However, it is not unusual for these same people to no longer love their pastors or leaders. Something goes amiss. There's an unmet expectation, the projection of outer or inner turmoil onto the life of the leader, or even a doctrinal dispute which can cause those we have loved to no longer love us, and in some cases, to even want to bring harm to us. It's very difficult to understand this relational dynamic in the life of the church. While it might be true that for every one painful change in relationship, there are 10 or 20 others that remain intact, it's the one that brings deep anguish. A friend relayed to me this story from his first pastorate. After a year or so as pastor of this Midwestern evangelical church, one of the more prominent members let it be known that he did not want my friend to be the pastor any longer. So he set out to not only have my friend removed from his post, but to also ruin him financially. When my friend finally confronted the man regarding his actions, asking him if he really understood the damage he was doing, the man responded by saying, "But that isn't my problem." The real horror of his statement was not that it was made in a cavalier way, but rather that it came in a kind of malevolent innocence that operated under the assumption that this was just how things were supposed to work in the life of the church. If you think your pastor should leave, the man apparently reasoned, then it is your right and even your duty to dispose of him any way you see fit. Well, unfortunately, stories like this are not unusual. They abound in pastoral ministry. Some of these crises are dealt with by mature elder boards or leadership teams. Often churches survive such scandals, but what happens in the heart of a Christian leader when the assailant is not a faceless member of a crowd, but rather one in whom much has been invested and entrusted? Even when a crisis finds resolution, how does forgiveness come? How can the pain of the attack be kept from destroying one's inner life? Christian leaders face a significant relational challenge in ministry. In seeking to live out our vocations in a context of love, we are always open to betrayal. Strangers do not betray us. A stranger might attack us or undermine us, but there's no betrayal because there has not been love. But when love is our operational context, then betrayal is a constant possibility. Again, Ray Anderson adds to this. Only where love and bond of commitment exist is there potential for betrayal. Every venture of love has in it the possibility, if not the seeds, of betrayal. Some people, Christian leaders in particular, have reported how over time a kind of relational shell has formed around them as they've attempted to shield themselves from the pain that can come out of broken relationships. That, however, is very likely the same process of denial that keeps a person from grieving the loss of a loved one. As many of you probably know, there are several models describing the grieving process, the most well-known being Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's work on death and dying. One other model brings a variation on the grief process by applying it to loss in general. There's first of all protest. There's the shock and numbness and confusion and anger and the physical symptoms and even a sense of denial that comes from this, saying, how can this be? There's the stage of searching. What in the world has happened here? There's a sense of despair. There's agony, depression, slowed thinking, often a kind of caving into the reality of the loss. And then reorganization. bursts of energy, intermittent interest, indifference, fatigue, detachment, apathy, a whole conflict of responses. And then finally, in a healthy process, there's reinvestment. There's moving on as the pain simply becomes woven into the journey of life. Well, when you think about it, it's easy to see how the loss of a cherished relationship can result in such a process. Think about the inner conversation that might occur in the first three stages when a leader loses a relationship with a person that has been deeply trusted and loved. There's protests. How can this be? After all we've been through together, after all I've invested, this cannot be happening. And then searching. What did I do? What broke the relationship? Who is at fault here? Is this some kind of spiritual battle, spiritual warfare perhaps? And then despair. I've given too much of myself. I don't know if I can ever go through this again. There's even a sense of reorganization. There can be forced distraction, loss of energy, isolation, just like in the prior listing. Well, people might move on from this point, but too often that moving on takes place without any kind of resolution or reconciliation. Now, multiply this by numerous people over the course of years. It's no wonder that so many Christian leaders report deep discouragement and depression. So, is this just the way it goes? Or is there the possibility of reinvestment, of moving on without carrying the soul-destroying disease of unforgiveness? In front of my house, there used to be a birch tree just outside the window of an upstairs bedroom that I once used as a study. One day I noticed this variety of birds gathering in that tree. I enjoyed watching them. So I hung a bird feeder on a branch that I could see from my window. And it was fun early in the morning to watch the various birds take the seeds from the feeder. And one day I found myself meditating on Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 6. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And I realized that God has made provision for the birds to have food to eat. And by hanging up that bird feeder, I was able to join into that process of provision by offering food as well. It was a joy to enter into God's system of care, letting His creative and nurturing life carry me along. That, I believe, is why we continue to care for people, why we care for the environment, why we care about all aspects of God's creation. We are invited not into some kind of cultural imperialism, but rather into the life that God brings. And I think that forgiveness is one of those things. Forgiveness flows from the heart of God. When I forgive, or when I am forgiven by another human, I participate in the dynamic, forgiving life of God that is already at work before I arrive on the scene. Forgiveness is not simply an interpersonal transaction that sets the accounts at zero. Forgiveness is intentionally participating in the restoring, healing life of God. But if I fail, or if I refuse to engage in the process of forgiveness, then I break a cycle of forgiveness that draws me into the life of God. That may be why Jesus said, "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your heavenly Father forgive your trespasses." How might we learn this life of forgiveness in a vocation that is, by its very nature, relational and therefore subject to inevitable hurt and betrayal? When we have not only been hurt by people, but also find that there may not be an opportunity for personal reconciliation, how do we truly grieve the loss? How do we forgive the offenders and then move on as healthy persons? Dr. David Augsburger at Fuller Seminary describes this process, and he calls it forgrieving. He says, in forgrieving, we gradually forego the anger at injury, the rage of betrayal, the resentment at duplicity, but without the aid of denial. For grieving refuses the shortcut to resolution that is offered by forgetting, the primary mechanism of denial, and intentionally remembers, returns to the loss, relives the event, retells the story as often as necessary until peace has been made at a level that permits the opening of the future. I would like to add to this story that when reconciliation is possible, the healing that comes on top of this process of forgiving can be overwhelming in a very positive and beautiful way. Many years ago, I served at a church and left the church through a conflict with the senior pastor. The senior pastor was then a year later fired from his post at the church, but I had moved on into another vocation. And I carried the anchor of that injustice that I felt was injustice anyway, for years and years and years. When I would recount the story of that season of my life, I found that anger kept being produced 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And 19 years later, I received a phone call, and it was this pastor. He had retired, moved out of the state, and he spoke quickly, fearing I would hang up on him. But he immediately confessed and asked forgiveness. And I suddenly began coming to grips with my own complicity in the process of talking behind his back in my own anger and sense of betrayal. And I confessed my own failure as well, and we spoke together in love and built a relationship that was now reconciled, an entirely new relationship. He was considerably older than me. He had just discovered email, and he began to email me words of blessing, whereas 19 years earlier, he had sent me nothing but words of condemnation. And healing began. And as the years went on, if I would recount the story of those days, I found I could talk about them very passively, and the anger just wasn't there anymore. Well, let me offer up a possible paradigm of forgiveness. First of all, we need to identify the guilt, calling it real. It's either a real thing or it's not a real thing. So we need to be unafraid to just identify it as something that's real. Secondly, we need to identify with the guilt. We have to come to grips with our capacity to do the same kinds of things that have brought offense to us. We are fully capable of doing that. And that's a statement of honesty. Third, we need to unlock the cage of unforgiveness. If we imagine the person that we have yet to forgive in some kind of a cage, then we are, in a sense, freeing that person from further punishment that we might inflict on the person through isolation. And so we free that person into God's care. But there's something shocking that happens to us when we do that. We start realizing that we've been letting ourselves out of the same cage, that we've been in that cage with that person the entire time. And it appears that the latch that opens that cage is not on the outside, it's on the inside. And we are now freed in doing that. We recognize that our unforgiveness has always locked us up with that person. And we are now freed from self-inflicted punishment and freed into God's healing care. And as Dr. Lou Smedes says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. This week you'll continue reading the Emmanuel Katongole text about the genocide in Rwanda, Mirror to the Church, and how it speaks to seeking forgiveness in the context of genocide. It's an incredible book and a challenging read in a difficult time. And you'll have a reflective assignment to pursue this week. You'll be looking at the dynamics of how we forgive others, but also how we might seek self-forgiveness, how people seek self-forgiveness for complicity in tragic events. Thanks and have a great week.